almost the complete package waiting to emerge on the scene. This could be something special. Denis Ten from Kazakhstan.
You're in the loop. We're here to discuss the ups, downs, and sideways of the sport of figure skating, and maybe give you +5 GOE along the way. This week's hosts are Kite,
Clara,
Carly,
and Lo. Here's a brief host intro.
I'm Carly. I live in Ohio in the US, and I'm taking all of my free time I have during the summer to learn as much about figure skating as I possibly can. You can find me on Twitter at CyberswanSP.
Hi, I'm Kite. I live in Massachusetts, and I'm currently sneaking away from my full-time job as a lab technician to work on my part-time job as a podcast host. And you can find me on Twitter at MossyZinc.
Hi, I'm Clara. I'm a French person living in London. I'm an ex-management consultant. I'm learning to code right now, and I'm basically an all-around soulless corporate drone, so I'm the one who's to blame for a lot of the stats that we're going to throw at you today. You can find me on Twitter at DAEJANGIE.
I'm Lo. I'm a teacher from the Midwestern US, and there's nothing I love more than a good step sequence. My Twitter is Let's Go Crazy SB.
So, we always start with a news segment, but today we have some pretty serious news to start with. So, on the 19th of July, Denis Ten from Kazakhstan was stabbed by 2 robbers attempting to steal his car mirrors. He was taken to the hospital, where he passed away despite doctors' best efforts to save him. Both suspects have been apprehended and have pled guilty. So, in memory of Denis Ten and all he did for figure skating, both in Kazakhstan and worldwide, we'd like to ask that you join us in a moment of silence. So, we'll talk a little bit more about him in the episode as it pertains, and we have a little shout out for him at the end of the episode too.
But to move into other news, over the past 2 weeks, the Chinese pairs team Yu and Zhang have not been included on the Chinese national team because Yu has a foot injury that seems to be recurring and pretty serious. And they've also withdrawn from their Grand Prix assignments in the fall, Skate America and the French event. So that puts a little bit of damper on the Chinese pairs' presence on the Grand Prix series, but we do wish them a speedy recovery, and that we'll see them in competition again very soon.
It feels as though pairs has gotten very, a bit watered down compared to last season. There's a lot of teams that are sitting out or are, have pulled out of the Grand Prix series, and it's kind of disappointing, but it gives an opportunity for some maybe smaller teams to rise, which I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, for sure.
So in another piece of news, Jin-So Kim has announced that this will be his final competitive season, which isn't really news, but I'm glad that we have a clarification, and I really hope that his final season will be everything that he could possibly want. So I'll look forward to his programs and kind of treasure them, just knowing that we might not see him again.
So we also have Anastasia Tarakanova leaving her coach Eteri for Plushenko, and I'm all for people leaving Eteri, not gonna lie.
I think that Plushenko still has quite a bit to prove as a top-tier coach. He hasn't really, had a skater that has really reached the top tier, in my opinion, so far, so I guess that's remain to be seen, but I do think that it likely will be a healthier environment for her to be with Plushenko than to be with Eteri. So, in another piece of news, Anna Pogorelaya got married in the past few weeks, and the pictures look completely lovely. She looks very happy, and I don't really know what this means for her future in the sport, but at the very least, we know that she's clearly very happy and is doing well personally, so good for her. I hope that she has a really happy marriage and it all goes well. The pictures are so cute. They're very sweet together.
Yeah, we wish her the best.
So, in our next pair of news, we have the Korean ice dance team of Yura Min and Alexander Gamelin have ended their 3-year partnership. It was kind of dramatic.
It was quite confusing to see news coming out from kind of both parties involved in that split, and I don't think anyone really clearly knows what's going on or what happened between them, but we do wish them the best.
There's a bit of a he said, she said thing going on right now between the two of them, and it's a little uncomfortable to witness, in my opinion. And I just hope that everything gets resolved as soon as possible, and they can both move on with their careers and continue in the sport if they would like to. So hopefully that goes well. I'm kind of disappointed because I really enjoyed watching them at the Olympics. I thought they did a good job representing Korea, and in general, I like to see ice dance or Asian ice dance teams do well, and it's kind of disappointing to see a partnership that hasn't like won a whole lot, but I think that they've made a bit of a name for themselves in the past season. So it's kind of a bummer to see them split, but alas, what can you do?
And finally, in more sad pairs news, the Canadian team of Seguin and Bilodeau has ended their partnership. Again, this seems to be really abrupt. As far as we know, they already had their programs ready. They had GP assignments. And it seems to be driven by Bilodeau and the fact that their results over the past few seasons haven't been quite what they hoped for. But it's pretty disappointing, and I think it seems to have been a bit of a surprise to Julianne. So let's see how soon they manage to get into the game, if they do.
I guess we could call it the comeback kid. Denis Ten, the door was open and he has walked through it.
So when we originally planned this episode, we wanted to talk about sort of the iconic news stories of figure skating. But as we started to put it together and build it into something that looked more like an episode and less like a list of notes, we got to thinking about the broader narratives that these stories fit into and what those stories say about the sport. So in the end, this has more or less morphed into something like a brief history of the last 30 years of figure skating, which is clearly more than anyone can cover in an hour, especially us, given how chatty we are liable to be. So take this as an upfront disclaimer. This is going to be sort of very whistle-stop tour and necessarily incomplete. But we hope that if you're a newish fan, you'll find it useful, either as a jumping off point to discover iconic skaters that you maybe haven't watched before, or just to understand the context behind the way figure skating news is covered, whether it's Alina's fully backloaded Olympic programs or the men's quad race. The other thing to note is we will be dumping quite a lot of dates and numbers on you during this episode, even though we promise to do our best to keep it under control. But we know that that can be a bit hard to digest over audio. So our graphics superstar Gabb is going to put together a beautiful infographic that summarizes a lot of what we're going to cover today. You will be able to find it on Twitter or Tumblr, so please do go check that out.
So we're going to start off with some of the biggest news and turning points in the technique that's used in figure skating here. So where we really begin, and one of our oldest pieces of news, is the removal of compulsory figures, which made figure skating into the short program and the free program. So compulsory figures are what gave figure skating its name. Skaters would trace circles, like figure eights, onto the ice, and they were judged on the shape of the circles and the depth of their edges.
And it was initially worth 60% of the skater's overall mark in the competition. So 60% would come from the compulsory figures, and the remaining 40% would come from the short program and the long program. And as the decades passed, the value of the compulsory figures dropped about 10% every decade, until it was finally abolished with the decision of the 1988 ISU Congress. And a big part of this was that they were pretty boring to watch on TV, to be totally frank. Viewers weren't super interested in it, and even the ISU and Skating Federation presidents called them boring. That's a direct quote. And the judges felt that it was hard to compare figures between skaters because a lot of them looked pretty similar, and it was hard to judge who had the best figures of the day.
And it took hours, right?
Yeah, it took like 8 hours to judge like a figures competition, which was ridiculous.
Like, how do you even televise that?
Exactly. I don't think they did. Like, in the end, they just...
Yeah, and then another thing that contributed to figures being cut, something pointed out by Dr. Hugh Graham, who was the current head of the U.S. Figure Skating Association. It would cut coaching time and rental skating time because it was just another chunk that you didn't have to pay for. And so it would reduce costs for skaters, which is good because money is a problem for a lot.
And this change really benefited younger skaters such as Midori Ito and Janet Lin due to their ability to execute difficult elements without needing to learn figures, which took years and years of practice. And this trend continued to present day. And you can really see it with the average ages of men's and women's Olympic champions since 1990. Since 1990, it is 18.3 and for women and 22 years for men. And previously, the average ages were 21.2 and 24.8. And the reason for this change is likely due to it's much easier to execute technical elements and at a younger age. And they also take a larger toll on your body, which makes the career shelf life shorter than they were in the past.
Yeah, Kite and I were discussing this. It's interesting the way those two intertwine, right? So all of a sudden you need a lot less time to learn those technical skills, so you can come onto the scene a lot earlier, but equally, yeah, the length of your career is, we think, probably affected by the fact that we're now competing on difficult technical elements rather than pure skating skills.
Yeah, I think that's been confirmed by some skaters, actually, is that I think Javier Fernandez said that you fall a lot harder when you're 26 than when you're 20. So your competitive career, I think, is necessarily shortened by the fact that you're pushing your body to do these ridiculous technical elements that weren't really needed to win, 20, 30 years ago. And that's why Olympic champions are on average 3 years younger now than they were when you still had compulsory figures.
Yeah, but speaking of technical elements required to win, another, change in technique that we want to look at is triple-triple combos in ladies singles.
So until recently, triple-triple combos were really the only major technical innovation that managed to take root in ladies singles. And the pioneer of this trend was Irina Slutskaya, who was the first woman to land a triple salto, triple toe, in competition at Worlds in 1997, the first triple lutz, triple toe at 2000 Grand Prix final, and the first triple lutz, triple loop at Worlds 2001. And Yana Kim really took this trend and ran with it to dominate the sport from basically 2006 to 2014, more or less. And her go-to jump, and especially, was the triple lutz, triple toe. She was the first woman to break 75 in the short program, 150 in the free skate, and 200 overall. Her record stood for 4, 6, and 7 years respectively. Only Evgenia, Alina, Caitlin, Alexandra Trusova have surpassed 150 since, which I gotta say, it's wild that a junior has surpassed 150.
That's what I was just thinking.
Yeah.
Absolutely nuts, but anyway.
I think it's also wild, though, that her record stood for that long. I mean, 7 years is like a lifetime. That's a career in ladies single skating.
It's multiple careers. Yeah.
And especially they didn't start giving the second half bonus until 2012. So, I mean, that's even just more, I guess, testament to how dominant she was in the sport for such a long time. There's not really a lot of precedent for that, I think. And it's amazing that she was able to stay on top of the game and just to keep up with the technical innovations, I think.
While not even competing every year for that
Exactly.
period.
Like, she took basically 2 seasons off. She came to Worlds in 2011 and
then disappeared until Worlds 2013, and then did not compete in the Grand Prix series of her Olympic season the next year. So she took a lot of time off, and yet still managed to be as competitive as anyone. So
yeah.
She was an extremely dominating figure in her time.
Yeah. Never finished off the podium, either in her junior or her senior career, which, again, is unmatched, I think.
Yeah, absolutely nuts.
So unlike triple-triple combos, there have been other tech innovations that some ladies have tried, but they never seem to really take off, such as the triple axel. So the first woman to land the triple axel in international competition was Midori Ito. And so she's the name I associate with the triple axel, not any other name.
Yeah, she was the first woman to land it at the Olympics as well, which she
and
did.
they were beautiful.
They were huge.
Those were gorgeous.
In my opinion, they're still the best ladies triple axel that I've ever seen, and I'd say that her triple axels are better than quite a few men's. Like, they hold up extremely well. If you go back and rewatch some of her old performances and her old triple axels, like, she could do it. It's beautiful.
They're big. Her air position's amazing. I mean, absolutely.
She's not the only one to have landed triple axels. We also have Mao Asada, who we consider like the last lady to have a consistent triple axel. And she also was the first woman in history to land 3 of them at the Olympics in 2010. And so when we say the last consistent triple axel, other women have landed them, but no one really has a consistent one. We've seen them from Rika Kihira, Mirai Nagasu, Elizaveta Tukumusheva,
Alyssa Liu, Elaine Chartrand, I believe Kimi Meisner landed it once or twice, and Tanya Harding also, it was a signature jump for her, although
It was ugly.
it was ugly. It wasn't nearly as consistent as Midori Ito, who was competing at the same time as her. And if you want to see what a true triple axel look like, look at Midori Ito's, don't look at Tanya Harding's, basically.
And especially now with IJS, I think it's not really worth the risk of attempting a triple axel because, again, none of the currently competing ladies have a consistent one. And just based on a point standpoint, it's more worth your effort, I think, to go for a triple-triple than to go for a triple axel. And you're more likely to land the triple-triple, to be frank.
Absolutely. I mean, again, look at the 2010 Olympics for the perfect example. Mao Sada landed 3 and still lost to Yuna pretty comfortably. It wasn't particularly close. And that's not a knock on Mao's skating. It was wonderful and beautiful, but Yuna was technically dominant, even without the triple axel. So it hasn't really become a mainstay in the sport because the triple-triple has been a much more efficient way to rack up the points.
Because you don't have the calculus that men have with quads, right? Where the base value is just so high that even with a full deduction, it's worth risking it. The triple axel just isn't worth that much compared to a successful triple-triple. So,
speaking of ladies who have made innovations in the field of triple jumps, Elizaveta Tokdamusheva is the first and only lady who has ever landed 4 triples in a short program, which she did at the 2015 World Championships, which she actually ended up winning. And one of those jumps was a triple axel. So to equal that feat, you would need to have a triple axel in the short program, at least. And no woman has matched that in 3 years that have passed. So it does seem to be still a little bit of a pie in the sky goal for a lot of ladies. And I think some are training it, but again, it's not, the risk kind of outweighs the reward, I think, in this case of attempting to, break that record or match that record.
Yeah, it's more of getting the name value of landing it.
Basically. It's kind of like a show-stopping jump, but in terms of racking up points, it's not your best bet.
But we've seen so few attempts over the last few years. I'm really excited, actually, now that we've got more juniors coming up who are attempting it at least somewhat more regularly.
Even in the seniors, a lot of the Japanese ladies in particular have mentioned wanting to land the triple axel. I believe that Kaori Sakamoto has talked about wanting to train the triple axel, and Rakuba Higuchi has trained it quite a bit, and I think it's pretty likely that she will land it, or at the very least attempt it at some point this season. She said as much that she'd like to introduce it toward the middle of the season, so I think that's something we can look forward to. So it's not as though the triple axel is dead or, completely missing from lady seniors. It is there, it just simply hasn't been the dominant figure that we thought it would be when it was introduced.
Our fourth and final, tech innovation with the ladies is quads. We don't see a lot of quads with ladies. As with the triple axel, we have a pioneer for quads. We have Miki Ando, who landed the first ratified quad salchow at the 2002 Junior Grand Prix final, but we haven't seen another quad from a lady until Alexandra Trusova, who landed a clean quad salchow and quad toe at the 2018 Junior Worlds.
And there are senior ladies who have attempted quads in international competition. Surya Benali and Sasha Cohen both attempted quads in their time, but no senior lady has ever landed a ratified quad in competition. And so I think this raises some questions about how sustainable they are on bodies following puberty and what it means for the technical limits of ladies figure skating. And again, with the not necessarily being worth the risk to gain those points from like a quad salchow when you could gain almost as many points or just as many points with a clean triple Lutz triple toe.
Yeah, and as for current ladies and having current senior ladies and having a quad, we have a couple ladies who are known to be practicing quads, like Gabby Daleman and her in-practice quad toe, but we still haven't seen any landed in competition.
I wonder if it's a question of equipment as well, like as blades get better, stronger, is that something that's going to help them get there maybe, or is it really a strength issue?
I think that's a really good question, and I guess we won't really know until we see it play out in the next few seasons. Although I'm wondering with the recent devaluation of quads in the Code of Points that we might see fewer ladies attempting them. That might be one of the reactions to the new rules, so I guess we shall see.
Yeah, my other suspicion, and so going to go on a mild data nerd tangent, but my other suspicion is that ladies' PCS is more penalized by falls than men's PCS is. Partly because they don't have the history of quads, right? So it's going to become this vicious cycle where you don't have the incentive to try it, despite what should be a clean base value minus deduction calculation, just because you know your PCS is going to get slammed.
Yeah, and I mean, there's something to be said about the fact that so few ladies are trying it anyway. So few senior ladies anyway are trying it. So I think maybe they have the sense as well that it's not worth it. It's better to stick to kind of jumps that are more reliable and are looked upon more favorably by the judges.
And I guess we'll see what the recent success of Trusova will impact on the ladies' field, especially in juniors. I think that we'll probably see a lot more junior ladies attempting quads in the next few seasons. I mean, we already have seen a lot of practice videos of, various, and mostly Russian ladies, attempting a quad Lutz or something equally wild. And, I don't think that trend is necessarily going to stop on the junior level, but I'm still somewhat suspicious on it truly becoming a mainstay in senior ladies, at least not for a while. But again, we can't really predict the future, and for all we know, Trusova might never lose her quad. She could, just be getting, 90 plus technical scores, even as a senior. So I guess it's possible, man. So
that would be mind-blowing.
That would be absolutely mind-blowing and completely revolutionize the sport, most likely. So, but personally, I have my own suspicions on whether she'll be able to maintain them as a senior, but we'll see.
So basically, as we've said, right, with the fact that quads don't seem to be taking hold, 3A doesn't seem to be taking hold, ladies have turned to backloading as a way of sort of differentiating themselves and maximizing the points they get. So as Kite said earlier, we get the second half bonus coming in 2012. That has now been somewhat reduced post the 2018 Congress, since the bonus only applies to 1 jump in the SP and 3 jumps in the FS going forward. But the change you see in 2012 is really remarkable, actually. Like, I was looking from the beginning of IJS, and up until 2012, literally not a single senior lady was putting more than 1 jump in the second half of their SP. Bonus comes in, and now almost half of them do. And sort of FS was always a bit murkier as a picture, but again, like, the number of ladies who were putting more than 3 jumps in the second half has doubled since that bonus came in. So it really has had a massive impact.
Yeah, and especially with this year, with the Olympic Games and Alina Zagitova fully backloading both of her programs, both the short program and the free skate, there was a lot of discussion that was raised about whether or not this maximized your technical score at the expense of your performance score, because you had the first half of the program, which is just the step sequence, the choreo sequence, the spins, and then the second half was just basically 1 to 2.5 minutes of just jumping. And unfortunately at Worlds, we did see the problem with backloading become pretty clear, which was that when you backload your jumps like that, having back-to-back jumping passes leaves you basically no margin for error. And your mistakes can really compound on one another because there's so little time to recenter yourself between jumps. And it's harder to improvise your jumps to get points back because you're done with one and immediately you have to be thinking about the next one.
I was really interested by the pushback on Alina's fully backloaded programs, actually, because the idea that just because you have all your jumps in the second half, it's somehow artistically lesser is surprising to me. I mean, surely it's just a matter of choreographing it better.
Yeah, because we saw some backloading from Kaori Sakamoto, and it wasn't even like something that registered for me. So it really just matters on good choreographing.
And I think that regardless of what we as fans might think about whether Zagitova's free skate in particular was very well choreographed, clearly the judges disagreed. She was very well rewarded for doing that. So clearly, according to the PCS, according to the judges, it was a well put together program. So I think that it's a little, part of me is a little baffled that now suddenly they're blaming her for, causing the downfall of the sport. And that's a bit of an exaggeration, but they're blaming her for removing the artistry of skating when in fact the judging system that they created was the thing that created her type of program in the first place.
Exactly.
So there's a bit of a there's a bit of a contradiction there, in my opinion. I also think that we need to remember that the reason the backloading bonus existed in the first place was because in the earlier years of IGS, front-loading was a huge issue. For example, if you go and rewatch some of Plushenko's old programs, pretty much all of his jumps were very early in the program, and the rest was just, posing, basically. So it's, again, it's a little bit, there's a little bit of, of IJS not really knowing exactly what it wants to reward. They're still very much making it up as it goes on, in my opinion. So it's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, she did get some, I think, unfair criticism on that. I did see people saying that she was kind of gaming the system, to put it in a little bit of a crude way. But she's playing by the rules. Her team is playing by the rules. It's the rules that the ISU created, and they're taking full advantage of it. And I don't think she should necessarily be penalized for that. I mean, I think maybe the programs themselves did leave some artistry to be desired, for sure, but the act of backloading itself, I think, is not really a subject for criticism.
I think that coaches and choreographers should be gaming the system, for lack of a better word. I think they should be doing everything they possibly can to maximize the point potential of their students. If that's not happening, you're letting down your clients. And I guess, the real challenge is trying to find a way to do that while still having compelling and artistic programs. And that's difficult. There aren't very many people who've been able to do that in the IJS era, in my opinion. There are a few, but not that many, and it's going to continue to be hard. It's, it's a hard sport. It's difficult. It's almost impossible to do, so.
No, I was just going to say, it just seems like a really weird line in the sand to draw as well. Like, why is backloading gaming the system when, I don't know, adding a not particularly aesthetic looking double loop to the end of a 2-jump combo to make it a triple, how's that not gaming the system? Like, anything you do to maximize points is fair and valid, in my opinion. The distinction kind of escapes me.
I agree. Again, it's kind of the double-edged sword of the IJS. So if you're going to move to an open-ended system like this, people are going to look for ways to get as many points as possible. And those ways might not always be the most aesthetically pleasing. So, I mean, I guess it's hard to really make that perfect system that continues to, uphold artistic standards while also, making innovations as an athletic sport. And I don't think that the IJS has quite figured that out yet, but it's going to be difficult. It's not an easy thing to do.
It's kind of fun to watch them figure it out.
It is fun to watch them figure it out. And, it's fun to criticize them for it, too. Like, let's be real. But at the end of the day, it's a difficult job. Like, I have my own ideas of what I'd want to see, but I have no idea if they'd work out. They might end up causing some issues that I hadn't really foreseen, or, So, I'm not saying that we should never criticize, ISU, because we absolutely should. But it is something that should be kept in mind, that it's, it's hard to please everyone, and at the end of the day, we all have different tastes in what we want for our sport.
And also to keep that balance between rules that get you the outcomes you want, but are still simple enough that this is figure skating. The rules are incredibly abstruse anyway, but are sort of still simple enough to be comprehensible. Like, on this backloading thing, it's called the highlight distribution bonus, right? You could imagine a world where you would say, you know what, instead of talking about halves, each jump needs to be separated from the next jump element by at least 45 seconds or something. But then that becomes almost impossible to explain to people and incredibly difficult to automate. So yeah, it is really tough. I agree with you, Lo.
So we've talked about, technical innovations in ladies singles, and now we have a big thing to talk about in men's singles, the rise of quads as a necessary element of men's skating.
So with the rise of quads, which began in 1988 when Kurt Browning landed the first ratified quad toe at the World Championships, we've seen kind of an accelerating pace of technical development in the men's singles field. So there was a 10-year gap between when someone landed a quad toe and a quad sal, and then a 13-year gap between the quad sal and the quad lutz, but then only a 5-year gap between the quad lutz and the quad flip. And so you can kind of see that technical innovations are coming at a much faster pace now. And what this means for the future of men's singles, I think, remains to be seen. No one's landed a quad axel yet. So that's pretty obviously the next one on the list to master, I think, for the men who are willing to challenge it.
And lots of people seem to be training it on harnesses at least. No, there's one stat that I want to drop in because I think it's quite meaningful. It's how many quads you need, how many different types of quads you need to have. So it used to be the case that you had maybe two quads, definitely two quads, you were a dominant senior man. So between sort of 2004, 2010, only about 5 guys had two or more different quads. And now in 2017-18, it was 29. So that just gives you another idea of like the explosion of both the number of quads and the diversity of quads that are required to podium in this day and age.
So speaking of quads as a necessity for winning, really the culmination of that argument was at the 2010 Vancouver Olympics in the men's event. We had Evan Lysacek winning over Evgeny Plushenko, and he won without jumping any quads, which to everyone in the know watching was seemingly undoable.
Yeah, I believe it was the first time someone had won the Olympics without a quad since 1994 in Alexei Urmanov. And it sparked a debate on what figure skating is really supposed to mean. Is it an artistic sport? Is it an artistic sport, or is it more of just an athletic sport? Although I really dislike that dichotomy. I think that you need to have both in a sport like figure skating. I think that artistry is built on athletic strength, but anyway.
To be honest, it probably also didn't help that it was Russia versus US, right?
Absolutely
No,
not.
it didn't help at all.
Especially in the US, how this was portrayed was very much as, the American is the true artist, while, Plushenko
The Russian robot is just the jumper.
Yeah, the Russian robot, which, in my opinion, neither of those designations are remotely accurate at all, but it was very easy for the U.S. media to jump on that narrative, which shouldn't have been a narrative in the first place, but they can't really help inserting some Cold War nonsense into their narrative as much as they can, so it's to be expected from NBC.
And like Lo said, I mean, you had American kind of skating teams weighing in on this. You had Frank Carroll, who's a quite well-known coach in the U.S., saying, well, it's not figure jumping, it's figure skating. That's a direct quote. And you just had this attitude of, well, if you're winning without quads, it's almost like you're doing something right, because that means that you somehow have the performance skill to override the fact that now you need a quad to win. And it was kind of the height of the debate, I think.
And quite frankly, I think that this attitude kind of led to a bit of a downturn in men's skating after Lysacek retired.
In the US, definitely.
In the US, excuse me, that's what I meant. And then it led to a downturn in the US, absolutely. They didn't really have a dominant figure from 2010 until the rise of Nathan Chen in the past 2 years. And now, of course, it's all about the quads. It's all about It's all about hyping up the quad king now that we have someone that can do it. I definitely think that this old-fashioned attitude in the U.S. that's, where we have the true artists, not the jumping beans, and it held down the sport in men's, and is still kind of holding down the sport in the ladies' discipline, in my opinion. So 2011 Euros is kind of what I consider the true end of the pre-quad era.
From a European perspective, I guess, even though it was a lot less relevant and received a lot less coverage than Ollie's in 2010. You've got Florent Maudieu in 2011 at Euros, who's the last man to win a major international competition without a quad. And it never happened again after that.
And I don't see it ever happening again. I truly don't think it's possible anymore. Especially when the top men, the men at the very top, are landing at least 1 or 2 quads very consistently.
With the rise of quads, they're definitely seen as a necessity, because you see a lot of celebration when a skater has a quad. And it reminds me of the fact that Julianne Yu recently was seen training the quad sal, and a lot of excitement followed on Twitter because it's kind of seen as like you are now a competitor. And it's very rare for like you look at the top 10 men and all of them are at least attempting quads. Only one of them has never landed a quad in competition.
It's kind of interesting that even our attitude that sort of getting a quad in some way makes you competitive now is kind of 4 years behind, right? Because if you look at the guys who are actually at the top and medaling, they have 3-4 quads. So getting a quad now, what does that get you? That gets you maybe a podium in a GP series event, but is it even enough for more than that? I'm not sure.
And it also brings into the question what really defines having a quad. See, because for me, to be considered to have a quad means it's ratified in competition. And there's a lot of discussion that can be around that question.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Carly on that point. Like, for example, Jason Brown. He has been seen landing a quad toe cleanly in practice. He landed a beautiful one at 2018 Nationals in practice, but he has never landed a ratified quad in international competition. So personally, I would not say that he has a quad. And I wouldn't say that he has a quad until he lands it clean, he gets the rotations, and he did get the rotations, I think, at 2016 Skate America or 2017 Skate America, but then he fell. So I would not consider that a ratified quad.
And I sort of see where you're coming from, but my only hesitation is like once you have a quad, do you keep it forever? And my example for that is like, so Yuzuru in 2012-13 was landing his quad sal with not amazing, but with some amount of success. And then you come to 2013-14, and all of a sudden he can't land it at all anymore. Sort of it's kind of difficult to draw the line, right? Like what sort of level of success do you need to, do you just keep your quad forever? Or if you suddenly can't land it anymore, do you lose it? Like it's not super clear to me how you draw the line.
I mean, his success rate wasn't 0 though, was it? Like he still did land it at some point, I think, in the season.
I think he landed it at Worlds. Did he land it before that?
He landed at Worlds. I can't really remember if he landed it earlier in the season. I think another example of this is Nathan Chen and his quad loop. He landed it once. We have not seen it since. Or even Shama Uno and his quad loop. He does not land it consistently at all. He attempts it pretty much in every free program, but it's very rarely landed. So, can we say is that he has a consistent quad loop? I don't think we can say that he had a consistent one, personally, and I wouldn't even necessarily say that, Nathan Chen has one. So I guess it's really up to one's personal definition. So
yes, go forth and argue on Twitter.
Please.
I think that with certain skaters, they get the benefit of the doubt. Again, I'm going to use Nathan as an example. Because Nathan is known for his quad mastery, people will give him the benefit of the doubt on whether or not he has a quad loop, for example, that they would not give that benefit of the doubt to Jason Brown if it were him.
That's definitely true, yeah.
Or if it were even, Kolyada, I think. So I think it's kind of an interesting double standard there. And it's not even necessarily an unfair one, but it's definitely present.
So we talked a lot about turning points in technique in figure skating, and now we're going to be taking a different route, talking about, figure skating's geographical center of gravity, aka, how different feds have handled, things that have come up and what countries have gone through in figure skating. So we're going to start with the U.S. skating team's plane crash, which happened prior to the 1961 World Championships, and their subsequent induction into the U.S. Figure Skating Hall of Fame. So U.S. champions in all 4 disciplines were killed in this plane crash. And you can kind of see, if you look in our data, it led to a deficit of U.S. skaters on the worldwide stage, and it just really had an impact on the U.S. in figure skating.
Yeah, and it wasn't until Peggy Fleming won the 1968 Olympics that you really saw U.S. figure skating start to bounce back, because the top skaters were all killed in the plane crash, and it left such a huge vacuum in the sport in the U.S. for such a long time that it took 7 years for the sport to really begin to rise in the world stage again.
And it's not just skaters, right? It's also coaches.
Yeah, coaches, other medalists were on the plane.
Now, I believe that prior to the accident, the U.S. had won almost every men's gold medal for maybe the past 30, 40 years. And, after the clash, it has not won almost every single gold medal. So, it's certainly, I'd say that I don't want to say that it's still impacting the men's field, because obviously it's been, over 50 years. But I do think that it has never truly recovered from that tragedy. And of course, it needs to be mentioned that the families have never truly recovered. Obviously, I mean they've managed to have hopefully fulfilling and healthy lives, but they can never replace the people that they lost. And I think that's the most important thing to remember about this tragedy, is that beyond the the impact on the sports, the impact on the people who knew the athletes and the coaches and everyone who was involved on that plane. So
you sort of touched on how there's not as marked as in Europe, but there's kind of a slow decline in sort of US men's skating, especially sort of post the 60s. And then there's a really marked decline in Europe, where if you look at where the world's medals used to come from, it was Europe for about the first 100 years of the championship's existence, and now we're sort of barely a blip on the radar as far as figure skating is concerned. And it really shows you that vicious cycle, like we were mentioning earlier, about you lose a whole part of the infrastructure of the US figure skating world in that crash. And on a few occasions in Europe, similar things have happened, right? So you get fewer medals, and specifically in the UK, for example, when Cousins retired in 1980, when he was really at the height of his career. He just won the Olympic gold medal. He was the world silver medalist. He was the European champion. He disappears. All of a sudden, there's less public interest because there was no one really behind him to pick up the slack. So figure skating becomes less popular. So there's less revenue, which means they invest less, which means future skaters no longer manage to attain quite the sort of elite level that the big name skater from before did. And before you know it, you've really engaged this like cycle of decline that's really hard to climb out of. So I think Cousins is an especially bad example of that, and we were looking, we're not quite sure because the records from the UK Figure Skating Association are kind of patchy online, but we think as an example of sort of how empty the field was behind Cousins, that literally the only senior men's competitor in the UK National Championships the next year was Chris Howarth, who you will now know as being one of the lovely British Eurosport uncles. But, I mean, the same thing has happened for men in France with Emodio, who we mentioned earlier, who retired in 2015, and there was really no one there behind. And possibly is going to happen with senior ladies in Italy as well, when Carolina retiring. And so just on the point of this sort of like vicious circle of funding, etc., in the UK now, figure skating has become so, irrelevant. I'm sort of being slightly hyperbolic, but to the public imagination, that there is now absolutely zero government funding for figure skating for the next quad. Even though we do have some moderately successful ice dance teams. So it's hard to see really how we start to climb back up that slope at this point.
Yeah, I think that the UK is a particularly interesting example of this trend of European figure skating, considering that they do have some of the most dominant and well-known characters in the sport. For example, Torvill and Dean and John Curry. I consider John Curry to be one of the greatest of all time. I think his skating holds up quite well, all things considered. Obviously, if you're familiar with modern skating, obviously his jumps are not going to be to your standards, but everything else about his skating is just as good, in my opinion. I would say that unlike the US men, the US ladies are still very dominant in the sport from, I'd say, late 50s until mid 2000s. A US lady was on the world podium for 35 of 37 years, from 1970 to 2006. And 16 of those years saw an American champ. The U.S. podium had a sweep in 1991, and Michelle Kwan medaled in 9 consecutive years, and in my opinion should have medaled in the 10th, but I won't get into that.
That's a discussion for another day.
Yeah, and I'll fight you if you disagree. Just kidding, but also not kidding at all.
Yeah. Relitigating 20-year-old world championships.
This was not 20 years old. I'm talking about 2005. Anyway.
Oh, okay.
Well, the kind of overarching theme here is that since 2006, the U.S. ladies have only won one world medal. That was Ashley Wagner in 2016. And the question is, what happened to the U.S. being so dominant in this field and then all of a sudden just being unable to pick up the slack?
I'd say that the biggest factor would be the change from the 6.0 system to the IJS. While other nations learned to adapt, most notably Russia and Japan, the U.S. did not. They still largely maintained a 6.0 mindset on a national level, and by the time that, other skaters from other nations had started to really surpass the U.S., they were basically so behind that it was hard to make up the slack. And I think that they still have quite a bit of ground to cover if they really want to catch up to Japan and Russia. I think that they're starting to kind of make those technical innovations at a younger age, but it's a long way to go. And the damage has already been done, clearly, as the U.S. hasn't medaled since 2006 outside of, a U.S.-held World Championships. We need to remember that Ashley Wagner was skating at home. She did amazing at that championship, but we haven't seen a U.S. lady medal at a non-American World Championship since 2006. So
you're right, and I think we mentioned earlier the effect of the Lysacek gold medal, and if you think that it takes, I don't know, possibly slightly exaggerating here, but 10 years to start training a new generation of skaters who have a different kind of technical aptitude, then if probably in 2010, the US skating establishment saw Evan and said, well, we're doing this right. Our emphasis on artistry is correct. And so you're sort of pushing back the time when we're going to see US skaters able to be competitive on an international stage.
Yeah, I guess I don't really see, a savior for U.S. ladies skating anytime soon. I think that they're still very much holding on to an old-fashioned mindset. And I also think that, and I've heard that, technically speaking, that on lower levels, young girls are not being called out for issues like under rotations and, wrong edges on their toe jumps. And that has really that hurts them quite a bit once they get to senior. You see that with so many of the top U.S. ladies having major technical issues, especially, in terms of under rotations. So until they really start hammering that on a lower level, I don't really see U.S. ladies coming back again.
So something that you kind of see in running in parallel to the decline of the U.S. ladies on the world stage is the rise of the Russian ladies. You see the rise of the Russian ladies really start to begin with Maria Butrskaya, who was the first Russian woman to ever win the World Championships. And then she is very quickly followed by Irina Slutskaya, who won 2 world titles and 2 Olympic medals. And she is the most decorated Russian lady ever to compete. And you've kind of seen this dominance extend even into the present day. So since 2011, 6 of the 8 junior world champions have been Russian. And 2/3 of all the junior world's podiums since 2011 have been Russian ladies, and they swept the podium actually in 2013 and 2014. So you really have this big bevy of young, talented girls suddenly being pushed through the junior ranks and winning a lot of international competitions.
Including the Olympic gold medal in 2014 in Sochi.
Yeah, Adelina Sotnikova winning the first Russian Olympic gold medal in ladies figure skating amid considerable controversy. Let's not sugarcoat that at all.
So in 2006, the Russian government increased figure skating funding by a factor of 10. And I don't think that this can be, overlooked at all in terms of the rise of Russia. Like, money's a huge deal, obviously. And the Russian pipeline strongly favors pushing teenage girls to major titles before their jumps go away or fail them. So most of the top Russian champions in recent years have really risen to the top at very young ages, such as Lipnitskaya and Sotnikova. A major example of this is Radianova, going from Russian champion in 2014 to 10th in 2017 and no longer receiving Russian Federation funding.
Even after Ollie's, right, they were interviewing Alina and Evgenia, and they were saying, we're already really scared of all the young Russian girls who are coming behind us.
And I think that this has really pushed the Russian ladies field, because there's always someone right behind them nipping at their heels and, pushing them to up their technical skills, up their skating skills, and it's really led the entire field to rise and to improve their overall levels. So Yeah, the depth of talent currently in Russian ladies, especially in juniors, is basically unprecedented in the history of the sports. I think that they won over half, maybe even more than that, of all junior Grand Prix medals last season. And I doubt that will change in the coming season, especially considering Trusova's dominance. And yeah, I think that the era of Russian lady dominance is here to stay, at least for another quad. So I think it's very interesting. I think that out of all of the federations, Russia is the one that adapted well the most to IJS, at least in the ladies discipline. We probably could have something else to say about the other three disciplines, but they definitely jumped on the rule changes with regards to the ladies, and it's paid dividends.
As we were saying, right, they churn out young senior ladies who perform, but are they being pushed too hard from behind, and artificially shortening their careers by overtraining, by risking technical content that they wouldn't otherwise, etc., right? Because they have a problem with career longevity.
Right, it's interesting that Lo mentions that these girls have kind of younger skaters nipping at their heels all the time, especially the senior girls, because you have something in Russian skating that you don't really see in US skating, which is top rivals training with each other. So, for example, up until pretty recently, Yevgenia and Alina trained under the same coach. They were on the ice together every day, and they could see how their rival was doing, and that's how they pushed each other. And this training environment, while it's quite brutal, does push out champions, because when you're constantly training alongside your top rival and kind of seeing them improve, then you feel more of that pressure to up your own game and to strive for kind of bigger technical feats. And there's always someone, I think, from behind you pushing you to either be the best you can be or you fall by the wayside. And that's, I think, a big part of why they've risen so dramatically in the past 5 or 6 years.
Okay, so moving on, we see another rise in a certain country's federation. We see the rise of Japanese ladies and overall Asian women in general. And so this starts off with Asian gold medal finishes and history makers like Shizuka Arakawa and Miki Ando. So we have in 2006 Arakawa becoming the first Japanese Olympic champion in any discipline, taking the gold medal in ladies. And then before this, the only Japanese Olympic medalist was Midori Ito. And then since then, Japan has not finished off the singles podium in an Olympic Games since 2006. So we really see lots of inspiration coming from there, and it's continued. We still see lots of Japanese women especially taking medals on the world stage.
Yeah, and you see between 2006 and 2008, Asian women actually won 7 out of 9 world medals, and they were also pretty heavy medal favorites for the upcoming Olympics. So kind of the Yana Kim Mawasada rivalry was the headline story of the Vancouver Olympics, and they made so many podium finishes together that they really spearheaded the suddenly dramatic rise of the Asian ladies. And since 2008, 15 of the 33 ladies world medalists have been from either Japan or Korea, which is a pretty insane percentage. Almost half from 2 countries.
And when we say Korea, it's all Yona.
It's all Yona.
So, to go along with the rise of Asian women, particularly Japanese women, we have the rise of Asian men. And there has been a Japanese man on the world podium in 8 of the past 11 years. Daisuke Takahashi was the first Japanese man to win, an Olympic medal. And in the past 2 Olympics, we've also had, Japanese men on the podium. And in 2018, we had 2 Japanese men on the podium, obviously. And of course, we have to mention Yuzuru Hanyu, who was the first man to break 100 in the short program, 200 in the free skate, 300 overall, first man to repeat as an Olympic champion in 66 years, first Asian man to win the Olympics. We could go on for like an hour listing everything.
This could be a whole episode in and of
This could be a
itself,
whole episode. Yeah, again, basically the most dominant figure in men's skating in the past 10 years was from Japan.
Yeah, we also have from China, we have Jin Boyang, who is the first ever man from China to win a world medal, and actually the first singles medalist since Chen Lu in 1996. And so this is kind of a shocking statistic and makes some of us feel a little bit old, But Boyang hadn't even been born the last time China had a singles skater on the world podium. So it was 20 years between the two, but looks like he's here to stay. So
He absolutely is. So in an ice dance, the major change of the past 25 years or so is the rise of North American ice dance. The first North American ice dance team to win a medal at Worlds was Shaylin Bourne and Victor Kratz. They won in 2003, and ever since then, basically, U.S. and Canadian teams have done extremely well at Worlds and the Olympics. The only U.S. individual medals in the past two Olympics came in ice dance, gold in 2014 and bronze in 2018. And of course, there's Virtue and Moyer, who many believe are the greatest to ever do ice dance. They've been the dominant figure in the sport in the past 10 years, I would say. And right now, the U.S. is basically overflowing with ice dance talent, in my opinion. It's incredibly deep, from, Chalk and Bates to Hubble and Donahue, the Parsons siblings.
Hawaii and Baker.
Yeah, Hawaii and Baker. Obviously, Shibutani is planning on coming back. It's incredibly deep. And while they're not literally at the top, because Papadakis and Cizeron are pretty much dominant right now, they definitely have the strongest depth overall, in my opinion. And I think that Canada has pretty strong depth as well.
Yeah, and so with Canada, we also, we see a lot of Weaver and Poje, even though they're sitting out this season from the Grand Prix.
It's kind of funny, actually, because you were pushing back earlier on this distinction between sort of technical and artistic, but there's a pretty clear trend, right, that as countries get sort of fall behind in the technical race by relying too much on sort of artistic qualities, forgive me, in singles, they do tend to maintain sort of not top of the top, but sort of middlingly successful ice dance teams, right? Which suggests to me that there is something, I don't know if it's cultural, I don't know if it's sort of the kind of aspects that coaches concentrate on when they're getting young skaters who haven't decided what discipline they're going into yet, but there does seem to be something there, right? Because North America and Europe now, singles basically off the map, ice dance doing pretty well.
Although I would like to push back on that a bit. Canada does have the current reigning world ladies champion.
That is true.
And last season they had two ladies on the world podium, so I wouldn't necessarily say that Canada has truly fallen behind in terms of singles. I think that right now their men especially is going to probably struggle for a few years as they, learn to adjust to life without Patrick Chan, but they certainly do have talent in the junior field. Obviously, we're all kind of interested to see where Steven Gogolev, how talented he actually is. Like, he's definitely an intriguing figure in juniors right now. And in the U.S. I would say that obviously we've documented the struggles of the lady singles, but again, they currently have the men's world champion. Nathan Chen is the men's world champion. So I would say that overall the men's is kind of struggling in the U.S. outside of Nathan and Vincent. But again, those two skaters are going to be challenging for podiums this season. So relatively speaking, I can't really say that there's a crisis in U.S. men's singles right now. So I don't know. Anyway,
You're right. I was being unfair. I'm sorry.
oh no, I definitely think that you have a point. But I think it's a bit premature to both Canadian ladies singles and U.S. men's singles. I think that those two disciplines are okay. Anyway.
Consider me chastised.
And then just moving on briefly to the pairs discipline, since 2002, we've really seen a pretty meteoric rise of the Chinese pairs. That's basically due to the influence of one man, Yao Bin, who was actually a pair skater himself, was pretty terrible. We talked about this briefly in a previous episode, and then decided to, instead of kind of dwelling on the fact that he placed last at the World Championships and the Olympics, turn China into a pairs powerhouse. So in 2002, one of his teams, Shen and Zhao, became the first Chinese pairs team to win Worlds, and then they went on to win the bronze medal at the Olympics. And then in 2010, Shen and Zhao and one of their compatriot teams ended up placing on the Olympic podium again, and Chen and Zhao actually ended the 46-year streak of the Russians and the Soviets winning the Olympic pairs event. And it was the first time in 46 years that there was not a single Russian team on the pairs podium at the Olympics. And so Zhao, who was on that gold medal winning team, actually is currently the coach of Sui and Han, who are world champions and Olympic medalists. And in 2018, to honor his unprecedented achievements for pair skating in China, Yura Min was elected to the World Figure Skating Hall of Fame. So there's a feel-good story for you.
Mm-hmm. It's a very inspiring story, and it just makes me really happy. And it's so nice to go back and watch their skates. Chinese pairs have been, for me, my favorite pairs teams.
I'd say one of the most widely impactful stories of the past 20 years was the 2002 Salt Lake City pair scandal. The basic rundown of this was the Russian team, which is Berezhnaya and Tsakarlidze, were placed first by the judges despite making a mistake in their free skate, while the Canadian team, Cellier and Pelletier, skated perfectly and were placed second. And basically the French judge was implicated in colluding with Russia. They struck a deal that to give the Russians the Olympic gold medal in pairs and the French team the Olympic gold medal in ice dance, which that did happen.
That did happen.
That absolutely did. Eventually, after all of this was revealed, both the Canadians and the Russians were awarded the Olympic gold medal, but this entire ordeal led to the change from 6.0 to the IJS. And one of the biggest changes is judge anonymity, which is meant to protect judges from retribution from their own side for not favoring a home skater, which this is an admirable change in my opinion. However, it led to some major issues later on, most notably in 2014 when Sanikova defeated Yana Kim, and many people, especially in Korea, but I'd say all around the world, were very suspicious about how all of that went down. So nearly 2 million people signed a petition for there to be an inquiry into that particular podium. And while it did not lead to any reversal of the results, it did help lead to the end of anonymous judging. So ever since 2014, we now do not have anonymous judging.
Ever since 2016, actually.
2016, so you're right.
It always takes the ISU a bit longer than we think to actually make the change.
So our next point, we kind of want to think about, the drivers of, scores. We want to think about nationalities as a driver and maybe training locations and certain coaches as a driver. So, this brings into, discussion names like RAF and Ateri and Gadbois and TCC. And we think of skaters from smaller feds who find themselves without bigger opportunities to grow on an international stage. One big name in, smaller feds, we have Denis Ten, who was a world medalist in 2013 and 2015, and, the Olympic bronze medalist in 2014. He was the first skater from Kazakhstan to ever win a world or Olympic medal. And so we can kind of tell that Kazakhstan's federation isn't even a drop in the figure skating ocean. But he did have an internationally acclaimed coach, Frank Carroll. So a well-known coach can help a small federation. And that leads us to Javier Fernandez from Spain, who Spain's first skater to compete in the Olympics since 1956. And he is also a two-time world champion, Spain's first skater to win an Olympic medal. And we see a lot of that influence coming from his coach, Brian Orser, which brings us to TCC.
Yeah, so since 2006, the Toronto Cricket Club, or TCC, as it's referred to, has been kind of a central training base for elite skaters. So they've coached technically three gold medalists for the Olympics, one Olympic bronze medalist, and world champions as well. So User Hanyu, Yana Kim, Javier Fernandez, all won world championships while at TCC, being coached by Brian Orser and the TCC team. And they have actually grown in size. The family is now increasing. And so now you have Evgenia Medvedeva and Jason Brown at TCC as well. So really cementing their reputation as kind of a training base for the elite of the elite, so to speak. And they have skaters from over 7 countries training there. And it's very much a place to be if you want to crack into the top tier of single skating.
In a different discipline, in ice dance, Gadbois in Montreal has become the home for virtually every top ice dance team in recent years. I think obviously Virtue and Moyer trained there, Papadakis and Cicerone trained there, Hubble Donahue, Chuck and Bates just moved there. The list goes on.
And so we're going to wrap up our discussion of kind of iconic news stories and themes in figure skating by talking a little bit about how figure skating is called a dying sport in some circles, and discussing viewership and how it's declined over the past few decades. And so you really saw the peak public interest in figure skating in the 1990s, and specifically with the Nancy Tanya scandal in 1994, and how they were both eventually named to the Olympic team. And the ladies' event at the 1994 Olympics actually had higher ratings than the Super Bowl, and as of 2008 was the 6th highest rated program of all time across all genres on television, and by far the highest rated ladies sporting event in history.
Yeah, in any sports.
And it was followed across the world. I mean, this was a story that just captivated the public imagination and still does. You have movies like I, Tonya, you have Tonya Harding appearing on Dancing with the Stars. I mean, even though it's been 24 years since it happened, it's still very much a part of the public conscience in the United States and worldwide.
And I think it needs to be mentioned that the Nancy Tanya scandal led indirectly to the founding of the Grand Prix series. Before the scandal, most of the main competitions were pro competitions. There wasn't really an amateur competition series until the Grand Prix series was kind of made to kind of capitalize on the extra attention that the Tanya Nancy scandal had put on the sport. So we can basically thank Tanya and Nancy for the Grand Prix series. Thank you.
It's the oddest thank you I've ever given.
The oddest thank you you'll ever hear, yes.
The only time I'll ever thank Tanya.
And again, we have to also recognize that when we talk about the interest of skating going downhill in the United States, that is not the case in Asia, particularly in Japan, where it seems to be as popular as ever.
Yeah, so in Japan, you've regularly got about 20% of the country tuning in to watch figure skating competitions, even sort of the more minor GP events, whereas in the US, we don't really know because the numbers are harder to get, what with the existence of Ice Network and all, but we suspect it's closer to sort of under 1%, if anything.
I think a number that sticks out to me with figure skating viewership being just wildly popular in Japan is Yuzuru Hanyu's Olympic free skate, and how I think he had 60% viewership in certain areas of Japan, which is nuts. Just ridiculous to me.
Yeah, that's Super Bowl-like figures, for the Americans.
So last week, our hosts piloted a pre-outro segment known as the Shout-Out of the Week, where we would like to acknowledge a skater or a program or an event that is especially meaningful to us. And this week, we would like to dedicate that to Denis Ten, who tragically passed away on July 19th. And he was a history maker for Kazakh skating and for Kazakh athletes in general. He was a big part of the reason why his country was able to bid for the 2022 Winter Olympics. And the past few days have seen social media just flooded with condolences from fellow skaters, from coaches, from figure skating media who really came together to share their memories of their time with Denis. And it really hit home the fact that he was a friend to everyone. And so we thought it would be apropos for us to each also say a few words about what Denis's skating meant to us. Okay, so I think for me, it was watching his programs, especially his free skate at the 2013 World Championships, back when I was still kind of a new fan. And it was, I mean, of course, a fantastic program in its own right. It won him the world silver medal. And just witnessing his outpouring of emotion afterwards drove home the reminder that figure skating, at the end of the day, it's not always about medals, it's not always about the victories that you can display externally, especially in a sport that's so heavily governed by politics and by the power of big federations, that a skater from a virtually non-existent federation can become a world and Olympic medalist was almost unthinkable at the time, and he did it, and he broke that barrier. And he really reminds me of a quote that was said by Siddhartha Mukherjee, who wrote a book called The Emperor of All Maladies. And he said that before Roger Bannister ran the 4-minute mile, it was widely thought to be an impossible feat. But after it happened, the realization was that you don't just break a limit, you break the idea of a limit. And that was what Denis Ten brought to the sport of figure skating for me.
Yeah, so for me, watching him at the Sochi Olympics as an unknowing 4-year fan has been something I've never forgotten, even, getting back into the sport. Back then, even I could tell that Kazakhstan wasn't a country known for producing figure skating medals, and that, he'd done something amazing and something that no one had expected, really. And so, even back then, I had a sense of pride that I haven't really felt many times in my life. And then his subsequent gala exhibition, the Warriors of Kazakhstan, was something that stuck in my head and has been one of my favorites from him. And it just really shows the passion with which he skates. And it just is one of the ones that sticks with me.
I think for me, more recently, it would be his FS from last year. And particularly, I watched him at the Golden Spin competition in Croatia. And he was skating to a beautiful French song called SOS d'un terrien en détresse, which was being sung by one of his countrymen. And he was having a nightmare with his jumps, like he did most of last season, unfortunately. And still, despite that, everything that was between the jumps was so beautiful, so sensitively portrayed, so light and delicate on the ice, that it was nonetheless an incredibly moving performance. And that's what I've always loved about his skating, just that he can connect with you so well, and he's such a fantastic interpreter when he's on the ice. So that wraps it up for this week. Thanks for sticking with us. Starting next week, we're moving our episode releases to Tuesday at 7 a.m. East Coast time, which is 11 a.m. UTC if you are not an American. And we hope that'll give us more time during the actual season to sort of bring you the quality and information that we would like to include in our episodes. So the next episode will be about the first Challenger Series competition of the season, which will be the Asian Open Trophy.
So if you want to get in touch with us, please feel free to contact us via Twitter at InTheLowPodcast or on Tumblr at inthelowpodcast.tumblr.com.
And we're on YouTube as well. Just search for In the Loop Podcast and you'll find our episodes there too.
If you're listening on iTunes, please consider leaving a rating and a review if you enjoyed the show. Thanks for listening. This has been
Kite,
Clara,
Carly,
And Lo.
See you soon.